Hey, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on wherever you're listening around the world. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is All Source News, also Stefano Rintdale. I am the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias, an AI data intelligence and collection company. And I specialize in Mexican cartels. And in this video, I kind of want to give you guys a rundown, a little bit separate than my previous series, where I kind of go specifically into each specific Mexican cartel, give you guys an story, an explanation, the kind of the historical context, what I'm looking for in the future, and this one, I kind of want to take a step back and analyze this from 30,000 feet, so that you guys have a better understanding of what is Trump really trying to do in the Western Hemisphere. Because right now, we kind of have a clear understanding that this is not just Mexican cartels; it's much more encompassing. And I did a previous video talking about the latest authorities and planning that President Trump was doing for military operations against, cartels in general in the Western Hemisphere. And I kind of alluded to this. This kind of screams to me that this is more geared towards Venezuela, and it does look like that's the case, and that's what's going on. From the military dynamic side, the military component side, I do want to give a shout out to Preston Stewart. A lot of you guys follow me because of his videos and all that, and I was a guest in a couple of his recordings, and he's been doing great videos, kind of laying out the military deployments of U.S. military forces in the Caribbean Sea and how that's impacting Venezuela. And again, that is true that a lot of this is geared towards Venezuela, much more so than the United States. And I think that's kind of the consensus right now. That I think when Trump first came into office, a lot of us were looking specifically at cartels in Mexico. Again, my specialty and my wheelhouse, and we've seen that broadening it out and now being much more laser focused against Venezuela. The first, kind of airstrike or drone strike that the U.S. did was against a Tren de Aragua speedboat in the Caribbean Sea and international waters. President Trump, in a post on Truth Social, indicated that they were doing drug trafficking and that 11 Tren de Aragua's members were killed. That kind of caught my attention because, you know, 11 people in a drug smuggling boat seems like a lot of people. I've tracked hundreds of videos and groups that are involved in drug trafficking, not only in Mexico, but in Latin America, even around the world. One of the specific accounts I focus on is actually a Moroccan drug trafficking organization that ships drugs into Spain and into France using, very fast speedboats to do that around the Mediterranean Sea. Never seen 11 people. Look, I've highlighted this in my Twitter account, my X account. I really don't know. I think it's a little bit weird that there was 11 people, and I don't know if there's more to the story. And I'm not really believing that this was necessarily human smuggling. I think there's much more to the story, but I just don't have the reporting for that. But that was pretty suspicious. And so this video, I just want to kind of go again, zoom out and really focus on the FTO list, the Foreign Terrorist Organization list, which is available on the State Department website. Anybody can Google it and go from there. And kind of give you guys kind of a little bit of a backstory on each and every one, kind of understanding what's going on, and more importantly, see what are the groups I'm looking for in the future that might get that FTO designation. So, you know, just going to scroll down a little bit. And before Trump came into office, these are the two ones that I think that are important to highlight. And you see it there at the bottom. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia People's Army, right? The FARC. This is one of the dissident groups, and this one, the Segundo Marquetalia. These two, basically, just for historical context and for an understanding, these are FARC dissident groups, and what that means is these were groups under the FARC that did not sign the peace treaty with the Colombian government, right? Because FARC did sign a peace treaty with the Colombian government, but there was a lot of dissident groups that broke off and continued to fight. And look, they fight under the banner of communism, Marxist Leninism, Maoism, whatever kind of communist ideology you want to think of. But for all intents and purposes, these are drug trafficking organizations that just masquerade themselves in this, communist ideology for insurgent purposes. And obviously, these groups, the FARC, have been in existence for decades. They were a key player in South America during the Cold War, fought against the Colombian military for kind of that communist inspiration aspirations. But now in the 20th and 21st century, really in the 21st century, they're drug trafficking organizations. And what they fight for is control of drug manufacturing, drug production, drug distributions around the world. And that's why Colombia is the largest cocaine producer in the world. These FARC dissident groups just really fight for that. And these groups were incorporated as part of foreign terrorist organizations during the Biden administration, right? And since then, it's kind of, no real updates have happened. And then we saw Trump come back again during the second administration, and now we've seen explosion of groups that were added to the foreign terrorist organization. So, this one we've kind of talked about extensively, from MS-13, Tren de Aragua. These two are Latin American gangs. MS-13 is out of El Salvador. They originated in the 80s in Los Angeles, And when a lot of their members were deported to El Salvador, that's when we saw them really expand and grow in power in El Salvador, really take a hold. Their rivals are the 18th Street Gang that are not an FTO designated group. But the 18th Street Gang and MS-13 was really a lot of the violence in El Salvador was because of those gangs. Since the administration of Bukele came into power, they've really clamped down on both groups. But I think it's also important to highlight that I think there's a public-facing measure where the mass incarceration, the mass prisons, and a lot of 18th Street Gang and MS-13 members get sent to prison. Obviously, that has really clamped down on their power and strength. But another aspect is kind of behind the scenes is a lot of negotiations that Bukele does with the leadership of MS-13 and 18th Street Gang, where they protect the leadership of both gangs in exchange for commitments from both of them not to increase violence in the country. So it's kind of like double-edged swords or two sides of the same coin, right? There's the head and the tail. The head is a hard security, mass incarceration, tough on crime approach. The tail is, hey, let's get in deals and we'll protect the leadership. Specifically, also one of the key aspects of the protection is they try to make sure that a lot of the MS-13 and 18th Street Gang leaders do not end up extradited to the United States. So they protect the leadership so that way they don't get extradited to the United States under the commitment that they will no longer commit violence against the U.S. Tren de Aragua is a Venezuelan prison gang that originated in the Venezuelan state of Aragua, and they really explode in growth and power and influence because of the Venezuelans suffered the largest humanitarian hemisphere influence across Latin America. The first time I tweeted them was all the way back in May of 2023 because opinion polls in Chile showed security was a huge concern for the population in Chile. And one of the main reasons of that was because of the gang violence that Tren de Aragua did, right? And so Tren de Aragua has obviously expanded a lot in the Western Hemisphere. More so in South America. We do know they're active in the United States, but not to the degree of some of the South American countries. I would also note that Tren de Aragua's presence in Mexico is not that big. It's very minute and small in comparison. Obviously, I think that's because the Mexican cartels obviously have much more dominance and controls it. Where you see Tren de Aragua's power and influences, let's say, again, Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, Chile, those are the main areas where they gang. But both Tren de Aragua and MS-13 are gangs, right? They're not the cartels that do the mass production, distribution of drugs around the world. They're more the people that, although do some drug trafficking, at the most of the times when you see them is at the lower level at the streets. That's where their most power influence is, not at the highest echelons of the drug distribution system. From there, we have these 6 Mexican cartels that were added as FTO, the Carteles Unidos, the United Cartels. It's a confederation of various groups that decided to join under a banner to fight the Jalisco New Generation cartel in Michoacan. Some of them are much more involved than others. For example, R5 or R5 in Los Reyes carteles. He's much more tied to the Carteles Unidos than, let's say, for example, Knights Templars, that is somewhat loosely associated with the Carteles Unidos, but really fights on their own. Another group was called Los Viagras. They historically were part of the Carteles Unidos before they switched side and now are fighting alongside Jalisco New Generation in Michoacan. So Carteles Unidos is fighting Jalisco New Generation in Michoacan. The Gulf Cartel as a unitary group doesn't exist anymore. They broke up into various factions, one of them, for example, being Los Rojos. But the two main factions that are really active of the Gulf Cartel is that of the Grupo Escorpión, or the Scorpion Group out of Matamoros, Tamaulipas, and then you have Los Metros and Reynosa, Tamaulipas, the Metros, although on paper are a faction of the Gulf Cartel. It was really well known. They had an alliance with CG&G. Recently, the Treasury Department alluded to, no, the Metros are basically CG&G in Tamaulipas, right? So those are the two main wounds. La Nueva Familia Michoacana, they're mostly out of Michoacán and Guerrero. They also have a significant presence in the state of Mexico. They're led by El Pez y Fresa, who have both been sanctioned by the United States. And they're fighting, for example, Jalisco New Generation cartel in Michoacán. They're fighting in Guerrero against a group called Los Telacos or La Sierra cartel. But very, very active group in those regions. Cartel del Noreste, they're based out of, their headquarters out of Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, but their predominantly strength is in Nuevo León and in Coahuila, and they're led by the Treviño family. The Treviños really have a lot of dominance there. The Jalisco New Generation cartel, again, under El Mencho, key leaders there are El Sapo, 03, El Jardinero, El Doble R, El Yogurt, Primito, which Primito, for example, is the leader of those Metros of the Gulf Cartel, but he's within the command infrastructure of Jalisco New Generation cartel. They're based out of Jalisco, but they're the most powerful cartel right now in Mexico and probably around the world with the most amount of international reach. Jalisco New Generation cartel recently reached an alliance with one of the factions of the Sinaloa cartel called Los Chapitos. Los Chapitos, as I've alluded to in many videos, are the sons of El Chapo. And the Sinaloa cartel, again, they don't, just like the Gulf cartel, they don't exist as a unitary group anymore. They're mostly two factions, Los Chapitos and Mayito Flaco, fighting a violent civil war in Sinaloa, Sonora, and Durango. Even in Baja California Sur, we've seen them fight. And Los Chapitos entered an alliance with Jalisco New Generation because Mayito Flaco is really pressing Los Chapitos. Mayito Flaco is the son of Mayo Zambada, who recently entered into a plea deal with the United States federal prosecutors after being indicted for drug trafficking, among a long other list of charges. So that's kind of the Mexican cartel piece. This one, Ansarallah, this is the Houthis, so that I will not cover that. Also, this one, the Baluchistan Liberation Army, that is a Pakistani ethnic group based out of Baluchistan that has also been designated foreign terrorist organization. So both of these groups I won't cover. I will cover these two, though. Gran Grif, Evin, and Sanam. These are Haitian gangs. And they're the main reasons why we've seen a lot of violence in Haiti explode and skyrocket, much more so than we've historically seen in Haiti, to the point where there's almost an argument to be made that Haiti has suffered from state collapse. Those two gangs were added there. One of the names you'll hear is called the Barbecue. That's one of the leaders of these Haitian gangs, specifically the G9 Alliance, that's kind of umbrellaed into both of these organizations. And the Haitian gangs have really caused a paralysis in Haiti and really have caused a lot of problems. Kenya, under a UN mandate, deployed over 1,000 police officers there to help the Haitian National Police fight against the Haitian gangs. Both of these gangs, they were not successful. And lately, we've seen Eric Prince, who was the former founder of Blackwater, deploy mercenaries to Haiti to fight these gangs as well in support of the Haitian National Police, because the Haitian gangs have been able to really dominate a lot of aspects of Haiti as a whole, and even the capital, Port-au-Prince. And that's why they were added as FTO groups. So those are kind of the latest ones there in Haiti. That's a country that really a lot of people should focus on, because it's a huge problem set that I don't believe gets enough attention. And it's not just because of the gangs, though. There's a lot of corruption within the political establishment of Haiti that really enable these gangs to grow. And this key figure, Barbecue, who has been sanctioned by the Treasury Department, and I believe also is made it in one of the most wanted lists and for the FBI because of his role in violence and drug trafficking as well. It's a huge problem set, and I think the United States, after the original designation, really incorporated these two as well to kind of highlight and focus the role that these gangs have really impacted Haiti and the threat they have not only to Haiti, but the Caribbean and the United States specifically as well. And one of the last things I would like to cover on the FTO list is these two gangs listed here. These are Ecuadorian gangs, Los Troneros and Los Lobos. They're kind of one of the main reasons why a lot of violence exploded in Ecuador, specifically in the beginning of 2024. They have a very much involvement in drug trafficking up to the United States. And they're also kind of connected with the Mexican cartel, specifically the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel. Basically, in Ecuador, there's a lot of rival gangs, with these two being the major one, kind of battling and fighting each other for control of Ecuador. It's important to highlight that the Ecuadorian president, the current president, is very much a pro-American, a very pro-U.S. president, very much in line with U.S. policies in the Western Hemisphere, has been very active in his support to President Trump's kind of policies and the U.S. policies in general, even related to kind of the Western Hemisphere, and has been very hawkish, for example, specifically against Venezuela. And he's been fighting these gangs. And it's important to note that Ecuador has designated the Venezuelan military, the Cartel de los Soles, as a foreign terrorist organization. We also saw that from the Dominican Republic, declared Cartel de los Soles as a foreign terrorist organization. So I think this was a way for the United States to kind of pay back that designation and getting these two gangs as foreign terrorist organizations. And like I said, this is one of the interesting aspects where you can although Ecuador, a lot of the gang violence is because of internal reasons and internal disputes and all that. We know, for example, Ecuador has the presence of a lot of international crime, specifically the Albanian mafia is very well much known to operate in Ecuador. We do also know that Mexican cartels, the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, kind of have a proxy war in Ecuador, right? They support rival groups and they fight each other. And this Ecuador is a perfect example of that, where the war in Mexico, the cartel wars in Mexico, has been exported to Ecuador. And this is where it's kind of serving as that proxy war. Because one of the interesting aspects, and I'll go back down, if you look at these two groups that we started this video with, the FARC dissident groups, as highlighted here, in Colombia, actually, one of the things we a lot of times see is how Mexican cartel, specifically the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel. And when I say, for intensive purposes of this video, when I'm saying Sinaloa cartel, even though I said they're not really necessarily unitary faction inside of Mexico, and that's true, when we're kind of zooming out, there's different factions. Obviously, the Chapitos and Maito Flacos have their own factions as well. But for the purpose of this video, I'll just simplify it with the Sinaloa cartel when analyzing it from an international perspective. When you're analyzing Colombia, it's kind of separate than in Ecuador because a lot of the reporting that we get that even though the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel might fight in Mexico, in Colombia, they kind of have an agreement not to fight there because this is where the drugs are actually produced. And Ecuador is where it's distributed, right? So they use their groups there and their proxy groups and to fight for the distribution. In Colombia is where it's manufactured, and they have agreements to maintain the peace because in the end of the day, it's not good for business if you have all your FARC dissident groups fighting each other. So when you're analyzing the FARC, there's a lot of different FARC dissident groups. These two are the ones that have made it to the Foreign Terrorist Organization. But there's a plethora of dissident groups. One of them, for example, is called the 10th Group. They're very much active also along the Venezuelan and Colombian border. And they fight one of their rivals, another terrorist organization historically called the ELN, or Ejército de Libertad Nacional. That's a Colombian, again, Marxist, communist insurgent group, really active during the Cold War, fighting in Colombia. And for all intents and purposes nowadays, they're just a drug trafficking organization. We had that, for example, the 10th Group, one of the FARC dissident groups, fight against ELN, specifically in Apure in Venezuela, that even the Venezuelan military went in and supported the ELN in their fight against there. And so that kind of comment leads me to the last point that's not kind of listed here, but it's the Sun Cartel, the Cartel de los Soles. The Sun Cartel is, for all I said this in a previous video again, they are the Venezuelan military, right? They don't exist like when we're talking about the Jalisco New Generation cartel where you see CG and G plastered. That's not the Sun Cartel, right? The Sun Cartel is the Venezuelan military, and the reason why they're called that is because the sun is the symbol of the Venezuelan military, and it's a way for the U.S. to basically label them as a drug trafficking organization, which they are, with this unique name to kind of maybe bypass some U.S. laws, et cetera, and make it a little bit easier for designation or even indictment purposes, because the Venezuelan military is heavily involved in drug trafficking. And we know that the Venezuelan military has a very deep-seated relationship with the ELN, specifically the ELN. And there's other FARC dissident groups, like the Segunda Macadilla as well. They do have relationships with Maduro. The ELN is probably the top player. And that's kind of the roles and responsibilities that they play. And I think it's important to know when we're talking about Venezuelan gangs like Tren de Aragua, that is an FTO list, Venezuela basically, all the gangs and groups that operate in Venezuela basically have different tiers, and the level of cooperation and coordination that they have with Venezuela, or even fighting against the Venezuelan government, right? Because the Venezuelan government, there are certain gangs that the Venezuelan government actively fights. For example, Tren de Llano. Tren de Llano is a Venezuelan gang that ironically kind of took up this mantle of fighting authoritarianism, and we're going to fight the Venezuelan government. And for all intents and purposes, in Indiana, there's just a gang, right? And so we do see examples where the Venezuelan military does fight certain Venezuelan gangs or FARC dissident groups. In other cases, like I alluded to with the ELN, the Venezuelan government and ELN are strategic allies, partners. They fight side by side. And then there's kind of a spectrum and everything in between. And Tren de Aragua falls somewhere within the middle, where we do know they have dealings and talks with the Venezuelan military and government, specifically related to the prisons, where the Venezuelan government kind of takes a step back and allows the prisons to be run by gang as long as violence is not rampant. And the gangs run Venezuelan prisons as they see fit. In many ways, even make them almost like amusement park. It's ridiculous. But that's the way the Venezuelan government can ensure violence doesn't skyrocket in prisons. They take a step back. These gangs take control. And there's kind of this cooperation. Now, if a line is crossed, the Venezuelan government storms the prison and the process starts over again, right? And Tren de Aragua kind of fits within that mold, right? That middle tier where there is active evidence of cooperation in certain areas, specifically in the management of prisons, but really not much else. And again, it doesn't really make sense for Tren de Aragua to be the strategic partner of the Venezuelan military like ELN, because Tren de Aragua is kind of the street gang. They operate down at the lower levels, right? That's kind of what they do, like MS-13. They're not, let's say, the Jalisco New Generation cartel that has this international reach, right? And is able to kind of distribute drugs internationally to then the gangs on the ground. So, for example, how I would say the Jalisco New Generation's responsibility, they're basically like your MSC ships, the maritime ships, right? They are your container ships if you're looking at it from a business perspective. They're Maersk ships. The job of these guys, they might either buy the cocaine directly from Colombia, or from some sort of distributor, or maybe they produce it internally depending on the drug. And then the hallucinogeneration cartel's responsibility is to ship it into the end goal, either through their own hierarchy from destination to end goal, or in somewhere in between where they have business dealings with other. And that's the main role that the Mexican cartels do. And then the moment it gets to the US, then the Mexican cartels hand it to whatever local gang or organized crime group that is operated, and it's their responsibility to either get it to a separate destination to sell at the street, or they sell it directly to the street, right? And that would be your MS-13 and your Tendaragua, right? That's where you would see them. Those are the guys at the street level mostly that are actually giving the drugs to the people. They're not the Jalisco New Generations or the Sinaloa cartel that really controls the drug distribution ship in many ways. And I think that's the fundamental difference when we're analyzing this. And going back to the Venezuelan military and the Sun cartel, what we're seeing is that the Trump administration lately has really focused wholeheartedly on Venezuela, right? When he first came into office, there was this belief that U.S. military operations was going to be focused and targeted against Mexican cartels. And what we're now seeing is much more so directed against the Venezuelan government under Maduro and the Venezuelan military. The airstrike was against a Tren de Aragua speedboat, which again, 11 people on a speedboat kind of caught my attention. That doesn't make sense. But regardless, that's kind of the construct within the Caribbean. It's not directed at the Mexican government or the Mexican cartel specifically, much more so Venezuela. And we're seeing this tit for tat. And I think this is going to be kind of the way that the Trump administration is now going to operate for the remainder of his administration. The Office of Director of National Intelligence 2025 Intelligence Threat Assessment, shortly after Tulsi Gabbard became the ODNI, identified as organized crime and Mexican cartel, specifically in drug trafficking organization in the Western Hemisphere, as the greatest threat to the United States. And today, Politico reported that the Defense Department, or now the Department of War, updated national defense strategy will incorporate and make a priority homeland security and homeland defense, much more so than countering China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, etc. And so this, I think, is going to be the kind of the future aspect. And within that construct, I think that the Trump administration has really viewed Venezuela as the main issue related to that for various of reasons. And obviously drug trafficking is a huge focus for the Trump administration, and that's where they're singling out Maduro, because unlike other countries, they can't really leverage that relationship to really go after them. Because even with political tensions with the Colombian president being Petro, there's still extensive cooperation between the United States and Colombia in targeting these groups in Colombia. They don't have that relationship with Venezuela because Venezuela basically picks and chooses who they want to go after and who they support or who they have. Simply put, the Trump administration is much more interested in targeting Venezuela, I think, than anything else, and that's going to be the primary thing. I would not look anything else related to the actions in the Caribbean Sea against Mexican cartels, which is against more my focus, as more of a Venezuelan. Again, I would recommend highly you all follow Preston Stewart for the latest on that. He's been doing a great series. If you're interested in other topics related to Venezuela or Haiti or anything in cartels, in addition to my channel, you have The Bluff, The Bottom Line Up Front, which is a Notorious podcast, which is the company I work for. We have our own podcast where we cover all these issues extensively. We have historical examples related to Haiti, the Haitian gangs, Venezuela, Ecuador, El Salvador, etc. And we kind of go into length on all those. So by all means, please give it a listen. Looking forward, what are the next areas that I'm interested to see if the Trump administration expands the FTO list? The question is, are they going to do this in coordination with South American governments, or are they going to do it unilaterally, right? Because a lot of the people that have been listed as FTO, although Mexico was not in favor of it, obviously, they did not want Mexican cartels listed as foreign terrorist organization. There's a lot of the political weight why they did that, right? So if you look outside of that, what are the next areas? I would look at Clan del Golfo in Colombia as being one, and then possibly Brazilian gangs being TCP, PCC, and CV, which is the Red Commandos. Again, there might be some of that political tensions with the Brazilian government under Lula da Silva, but again, maybe the U.S. leverages kind of that tension to kind of mark themselves and kind of put the onus on the Brazilian government, because we do see those gangs really gaining strength, specifically in Brazil. And I've alluded to this in many episodes and said, like, if there's a moment where Mexican cartels are kind of weakened, just as the Mexican cartels took over from the Colombian cartels, the one that I would look at to, if there's a scenario where Mexican cartels get weakened and get taken over, it would be the Brazilian gangs, right? So that is kind of the next step. I don't know if that's necessarily going to happen. That's kind of where I'm speculating, because those would be, at least if you look at the current construct of how the United States has gone with FTO designations, Ecuador and Haiti are more because of the violence that they cause locally. But if you're looking at them from a transnational criminal organization like the Sun cartel and the Mexican cartels, The ones that really do fit that mold are the Brazilian gangs, specifically PCC and Red Commando. They have really grown much more so, and to the point where you might not can't really refer to them as gangs anymore, but you really have to refer to them as advanced transnational criminal organizations or drug trafficking organizations that are starting to operate much more so as Jalisco New Generation or these other cartels compared to, let's say, MS-13 and Tren de Aragua. So that's the next area that I'd be looking for. But again, I really hope you guys like this video. I just kind of wanted to zoom out, give you the 30,000, 50,000 foot overview, holistically, kind of how the Trump administration did this, even with some historical context, how some of them are interplay, some of them are not. For example, Haiti and the situation in Haiti has really nothing to do with Ecuador, Colombia, or Mexico. But you look at Ecuador, there is a somewhat connection to the situation in Mexico, the situation in Colombia and Venezuela. There is some tie in. So each country is different, but we are seeing a hemispheric approach against Argentina, Ecuador, Dominican Republic have all declared the Sun Cartel, the Venezuelan military, as foreign terrorist organizations. And we're starting to see somewhat of coalescing in certain South American countries more politically aligned with the Trump administration follow a much more harder step against Venezuela. But again, the Mexican cartels really the only ones have taken a significantly hard step is the United States, but they haven't really done any unilateral operations. I think the Mexican government has done a good job of kind of making sure that everything done is either bilaterally or Mexican led, and the U.S. kind of takes a step back with substantial amount of support. So this is the situation we're looking at. I think unfortunately we might be in a scenario where war with Venezuela is closer than many of us anticipate or think. So that's something that I'm going to definitely keep an eye on, and I will make sure to give you guys the latest when it does. But with that, I want to thank you everybody for your time today, and I'll see you guys very soon.